Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that's often forgotten amid the chaos of tanks, trenches and total war. What did World War II soldiers actually eat? From American K rations to German ersatz bread, Soviet cabbage soup to Japanese rice balls, tonight we're peeling back the layers of history, one can of corned beef at a time. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before a single shot was fired, before tanks rumbled across Europe or planes screamed overhead, every army faced one universal, unglamorous challenge: feeding its soldiers without killing them in the process. Let's be honest, when we think of World War II, we imagine battles, bravery, and black and white newsreels. Rarely do we stop to ask the really gritty questions like, did that guy storming Normandy have breakfast? And if so, what on earth was it? Spoiler, it wasn't pancakes. Feeding millions of men across continents wasn't just a culinary experiment. It was a logistical nightmare with a side of dysentery. Rations had to be portable, non-perishable, cheap, and preferably not make you cry after eating them. Flavor was a distant fifth priority, somewhere between won't explode if dropped and doesn't attract rats. Different nations approached the problem in different ways. The Americans tried to science their way to sustenance, producing little boxes of optimism called K rations. The Germans, early in the war, sent troops out with hearty meat and rye, then eventually replaced it all with something resembling punishment in a can. The British clung to tea like it was holding the empire together. It probably was. The Soviets boiled cabbage like it was a sacred tradition. And the Japanese, well, they were expected to travel light and fight hard, sometimes on just rice balls and hope. Food wasn't just fuel, it was morale. A hot meal could lift spirits. A cold tin of greasy corned beef could crush them. Some soldiers developed fondness for their rations. Others swore they'd never eat a cracker again. Many dreamed not of glory or victory, but of butter, bread, and anything that didn't come wrapped in brown paper. And while generals debated strategy in war rooms, privates in foxholes were bartering chocolate for cigarettes and praying the guy next to them didn't snore through mess call. So tonight, we're not talking about battles won or borders redrawn. We're talking about spam, crackers, powdered eggs, and the real war, between soldiers and the strange, suspicious contents of their ration tins. Because if there's one universal truth about war, it's that everyone has to eat, even if the food fights back. All right, you're a US soldier in World War II. You've marched 10 miles, been shot at 6 times, and haven't seen a flush toilet in weeks. Your stomach is making sounds that could qualify as artillery. What do you get? The K ration. A compact, calorie-packed cardboard miracle designed by people who clearly hadn't eaten one themselves. Let's break it down. The K ration came in 3 boxes: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They were about the size of a small brick, and sometimes felt like one. Each box contained just enough food to technically qualify as nutrition, while emotionally preparing you for combat via culinary disappointment. Breakfast kicked off strong. A can of ham and eggs, which was neither hammy nor eggy. The texture? Think Spam meets drywall. Toss in rock-hard crackers, instant coffee, powdered lemonade. Why? A couple of sticks of gum, 4 cigarettes, because nothing says balanced breakfast like a Marlboro. And best of all, 1 single sheet of toilet paper. Just one. Make it count. Lunch was not better. You might get cheese spread with more chemicals than cheese, another stack of jaw-shattering biscuits, and a chocolate bar so dense it could double as tank armor. No spoon? No problem. You'd use your knife, a stick, or blind rage to scoop it out. Dinner was meat and beans, which looked like a crime scene in a can. With it, more crackers, more gum, and sometimes, if you prayed hard, a tiny fruit bar, which tasted like someone whispered the word apple over a piece of wood. Despite their taste, K rations were nutritional marvels. Roughly 3,000 calories a day, packed with protein, fat, sugar, and just enough flavour to ensure you didn't accidentally enjoy it. Troops often swapped components like prison traders. Cigarettes for chocolate, cheese for crackers, anything to dodge the ham-egg trauma. But every now and then, you'd find a Hershey bar. Real chocolate. Real comfort. For one bite, you weren't in the mud. You were back home. That alone made the rest of the ration worth tolerating. So yes, the K ration was dry, weirdly square, and kind of tasted like war. But in the end, it was the fuel that helped win a global conflict, one questionable meat product at a time. If the K ration was the army's idea of a meal, then the D ration was their idea of a survival threat disguised as dessert. The D ration looked like a chocolate bar, came wrapped like a chocolate bar, and was issued to soldiers as a chocolate bar. But that's where the similarities ended, because this wasn't your sweet little Hershey's Kiss. No, the D ration was engineered in coordination with the US Army to do three things. 1. Not melt. 2. Last forever. And 3. Taste like absolute despair. It was roughly the size of a deck of cards and dense enough to stop a bullet. In fact, some soldiers swore it had, whether in their packs or their intestines. The ingredients were technically food: chocolate, sugar, oat flour, and a little cocoa fat. The result? A brown brick that could double as a bludgeon or emergency building material. Why was it made this way? Because it had to survive the tropics, deserts, and frozen tundras without turning into goo. And the military specifically requested it be unappetizing, so soldiers wouldn't eat it unless they were actually starving. Mission accomplished. The bar was so hard that biting into it without softening it first could lead to dental emergencies. Some guys tried grating it into hot water. Others just stared at it in confusion. A few, legend says, used it to hammer tent stakes. But hey, it had calories. About 600 per bar, which could keep a man alive through a day of combat. Barely. If you were trapped behind enemy lines, or stuck in a foxhole with nothing but your rifle and bad decisions, the D ration might just save your life. Emotionally, not so much. To the Army's credit, they did eventually realise feeding troops chocolate that doubled as masonry was not great for morale. Later iterations of the D ration got slightly softer and vaguely more edible. But the damage was done. Soldiers remembered the original bar with the same fondness one remembers dental surgery. So next time you hear someone say, "Chocolate makes everything better," remember the D ration, the bar that proved them wrong. If the K ration was survival food, and the D ration was edible punishment, then the field kitchen was a soldier's only shot at eating something warm, recognisable, and only mildly soul-crushing. Field kitchens, also known as rolling misery carts, were mobile food units pulled behind trucks or horses. They were the military's attempt at fine dining on the go. And by fine, we mean not cold and in a can. These kitchens churned out industrial-sized vats of stew, beans, gravy-like substances, and enough coffee to power an infantry division through a mild existential crisis. Meals were served cafeteria-style. You'd line up with your trusty mess kit, a metal tray that looked like it belonged in a science experiment, and shuffle forward, praying the guy ahead didn't take the last ladle of something vaguely meat-coloured. The food was ladled out with military precision. One scoop for you, one suspicious stare, and on to the next, private. The menu? It depended on where you were. In Europe, you might get creamed chipped beef on toast, affectionately and permanently renamed by the troops as SOS, or stuff on a shingle, though most used a less polite S word. In the Pacific, you were lucky if it wasn't just rice and hot dog fragments swimming in broth. Coffee, though, was sacred. It was strong, bitter, and brewed in quantities large enough to reanimate the dead. Soldiers drank it hot, cold, black, or with powdered milk, as long as it kept them awake and angry. The best part of the field kitchen experience? The smell. It meant food was coming. The worst part? everything else. Your food was served outdoors, often in rain, snow, or the kind of mud that had its own ecosystem. You sat on rocks, helmets, or the ground. There were no forks. There was no ambience. Just you, your friends, and a tin of beans that might be older than your commanding officer. Still, when it was hot and vaguely chewable, field kitchen food felt like heaven. It wasn't glamorous, but in a world of chaos, bullets, and K-rations, it was the closest thing to comfort food. At the start of World War II, German soldiers marched into battle with swagger, clean uniforms, and something shockingly rare in wartime logistics: actual food that resembled real meals. The early war Wehrmacht ration was downright luxurious compared to what most other armies were choking down. A standard soldier's pack included rye bread, sausages, butter, cheese, canned meats, marmalade, and coffee. Well, ersatz coffee, which we'll discuss later with the disgust it deserves. Each soldier was expected to carry his own food for a couple of days. A noble idea, until you realised how much weight that was once you added rifles, ammunition, grenades, and frostbite. Still, German rations were built around the concept of 3 hot meals a day, with field kitchens trailing behind like slightly overworked food trucks. Breakfast could be dark rye bread with jam or butter, plus that roasted acorn faux coffee. Lunch? Tinned meat, cheese, and maybe a boiled potato or 3. Dinner, if you were lucky and not actively being shelled, might be soup or stew made from whatever was still moving that morning. Sausage, especially Mettwurst and Leberwurst, was a staple. It was easy to transport, packed with protein, and vaguely comforting. Also, incredibly smelly in a sealed tin, which made every trench a blend of iron, sweat, and spicy pork aroma. And of course, Germans had bread. Good bread, real bread. Soldiers often reminisced more about losing access to proper bread than about losing a warm bed. One Wehrmacht veteran described ration bread as the only softness in an otherwise very sharp war. Field kitchens backed this system up, churning out steaming pots of stews, boiled meats and dumplings when possible. Morale was high, stomachs were relatively full, and German efficiency seemed unstoppable. But, and there's always a but, this early golden age of German rations wouldn't last. As the war expanded and supply lines stretched thin, the sausage turned sour, the bread got stale, and the once proud field kitchens were left stranded in frozen forests with nothing but frozen potatoes and patriotic memories. Still, for a brief, bratwurst-filled moment, the average German soldier had something precious in war: warm food, decent coffee substitutes, and the illusion that this whole thing might be over by Christmas. As World War II dragged on and Hitler's dream of blitzkrieg glory turned into a logistical nightmare, German rations took a sharp turn, straight into the land of ersatz, a German word that basically means imitation. Or more accurately, this isn't food, but we're calling it that anyway. By 1942, things were getting creative. Real coffee? Gone. In came Ersatzkaffee, a charming blend of roasted acorns, chicory, sugar beet, or barley. It smelled like despair and tasted like something brewed in an old boot. It technically resembled coffee, if you'd never had coffee before and were very forgiving. Bread? Once dark, hearty, and soul-sustaining, it was now packed with fillers: sawdust, straw flour, potato starch, and whatever else they could legally grind into powder. You might still call it bread, but your teeth would disagree. Some soldiers joked it doubled as helmet padding. Butter disappeared too, replaced by ersatz margarine, a pale, tasteless grease that was somehow both oily and chalky. Meat became a memory. Cans of meat product started showing up. Labels didn't specify the animal, and honestly, it was better not to ask. Even sausages, that sacred pillar of German cuisine, were diluted. Horse meat entered the mix. Then turnip filler. Eventually, some sausages were up to 40% plant material. Imagine biting into a bratwurst and getting a mouthful of damp newspaper. Welcome to the Reich's culinary downfall. The problem wasn't just taste. These ersatz rations lacked nutrients, calories, and morale. Troops in the east were burning thousands of calories in sub-zero weather and getting food that couldn't even sustain a dachshund. Starvation, sickness, and desperation followed. Soldiers got inventive, boiling shoe leather, bartering with locals, or raiding enemy supply lines just to get something real. A single American chocolate bar was worth more than a stack of Wehrmacht bread. What had begun as an efficient, fuel-powered war machine was now being run on cabbage water and caffeine lies. The Germans had started with real food. Now they were chewing misery and washing it down with roasted roots. If there was a place where food went to die during World War II, it was the Eastern Front. Stretching thousands of miles from Berlin to the deep, frozen belly of Russia, the Eastern Front was the logistical equivalent of trying to run a pizza delivery service across a glacier while being shot at, shelled, and occasionally eaten by wolves. German soldiers, who once feasted on sausage and rye, found themselves crouched in snowdrifts with frozen fingers and empty stomachs. Rations shrank, supply lines collapsed, and morale thawed faster than the soup, which is to say, not at all. Let's talk about that soup. Meal on the Eastern Front often meant hot water with a few potato peels if you were lucky. If you weren't, it was just water, frozen solid by the time it got to you. Bread? It arrived mouldy or not at all. Meat? Rumour only. Soldiers burned precious firewood not to warm themselves, but to thaw their canned meat products, which might have been beef, pork, or recycled optimism. And God help you if the label had worn off. You'd have to sniff your way through the mystery. In winter, men boiled snow for drinking water, heated tins over engine blocks, and sometimes ate snow out of desperation, which sounds harmless until you realise it lowers your core body temperature and brings you one step closer to freezing to death with a mouthful of slush. Then, there were the rats, bold, fat, and suspiciously well fed. Some units resorted to catching and cooking them. Others considered the rats rivals, stealing scraps from each other in midnight battles that historians mercifully don't teach in classrooms. Desperation also led to bartering. Soldiers traded cigarettes for bread, buttons for sugar, or a pair of socks for half a boiled potato. A single spoonful of jam could start a fight. If you had chocolate, you were a god. Despite the hunger, the cold, and the lack of anything resembling a balanced meal, soldiers endured. They joked, swore, and ate whatever they could scrounge. But every mealtime became a grim ritual. Unwrap the tin, say a silent prayer, and hope it didn't bite back. On the Eastern Front, food wasn't just scarce. It was a cruel game of survival, played one frozen spoonful at a time. If German troops on the Eastern Front were eating misery, Soviet soldiers were chewing on sheer willpower. The Red Army's approach to nutrition was simple. If it filled a stomach and didn't kill you immediately, it was dinner. The official rations: black bread, cabbage soup, buckwheat porridge, kasha, a few boiled potatoes, maybe dried fish, and the ever-reliable, unsweetened tea. In winter, that tea was usually melted snow with a twig in it. Meat was listed on paper, yes. In reality, rare as a warm bath in Stalingrad. When meat did arrive, it was often salted to the point that chewing it was more of a jaw exercise than a meal. Still, it was considered a luxury. Soldiers licked the fat off old meat tins just to savour the memory. And then there was the bread, a staple of every Soviet meal. It was coarse, black, and made from whatever grain was still legal to eat. It was also strictly rationed. A typical serving could fit in your palm and be gone in 2 bites, if you didn't try to save it by licking it slowly like a sad war lollipop. Cabbage was the hero of Soviet cuisine. Soup, stew, stuffed, shredded or fermented. If there was a pot, there was cabbage in it. So much cabbage, in fact, that some Soviet soldiers joked they smelled it in their sleep and dreamed of becoming turnips just to escape the cycle. Still hungry? Good. Now you understand the Soviet wartime diet. Soldiers routinely went into combat underfed and overexerted. Rations were supposed to be delivered daily, but in war-torn zones, that became when possible, which often meant never. So they improvised. foraging became a way of life. Soldiers dug up frozen potatoes from abandoned farms, shot wild animals when they could, and bartered cigarettes or spare boots for a boiled egg. Occasionally, they even traded with German POWs, food for silence. The miracle: they endured, malnourished, exhausted, but relentless. Soviet troops pressed forward on fumes and boiled cabbage, proving that sometimes what feeds a soldier isn't calories, it's pure cabbage-fueled stubbornness. When official rations ran dry, which was often, Soviet soldiers didn't starve quietly, they adapted loudly. With creativity, desperation, and occasionally the culinary sensibilities of a raccoon, Red Army troops turned battlefield improvisation into an extreme sport. Let's say you're a soldier outside Leningrad. You haven't seen a delivery truck in a week. Your cabbage soup is now just water with a floating leaf, and your last piece of black bread has grown a beard. What do? Option 1. Forage. Soldiers scoured the countryside for anything remotely edible: berries, tree bark, boiled grass, dandelions, even flower bulbs. One particularly resourceful unit figured out how to roast shoe leather, not because it tasted good, it didn't, but because it was technically organic. Option 2. Barter. A spare pair of socks might earn you a potato. A broken watch, maybe a spoonful of lard. Tobacco was currency, soap was gold. And if you had a tin of meat, you could get someone to write a letter home and clean your rifle. Option 3. Theft, or as they called it, unauthorized logistics. Soviet soldiers occasionally raided abandoned German outposts just for food. One Red Army veteran recalled the sheer euphoria of finding a box of Wehrmacht sausages. The first time I cried and salivated at the same time. Field kitchens, when functional, were masters of mystery cooking. Cooks tossed in whatever they had: beets, onions, mystery meat, pickled vegetables from 1913. The resulting soup was red, hot, and suspiciously chewy. But it kept you going. Mostly. And yet, morale didn't collapse. Why? Because Soviet culture glorified suffering as proof of strength. Soldiers turned deprivation into a badge of honor. They told jokes about their rations. They sang songs about dried fish. They gave names to their tin cups, which was either camaraderie or a mild fever dream. In the Red Army, mealtime wasn't about flavor, it was about survival theater. Every bowl of borscht, every crumb of bread was a statement: we're still here. If World War II were judged solely by culinary performance, the British Army might have been forced to surrender to its own menu. British soldiers didn't eat, they endured. Their rations were a war within the war, a daily ritual of unseasoned punishment, washed down with eternal optimism and as much tea as humanly possible. Let's start with the sacred trinity: tea, hardtack biscuits, and bully beef. Tea was everything. More than a drink. It was morale in liquid form. Soldiers brewed it in tin mugs, mess tins, helmets, anything that held heat and didn't leak too much. Sometimes there was no milk, no sugar, no dignity, just hot brown water and hope. But it got them through. Hardtack biscuits were designed to outlive the soldier. Dense, chalky, and almost completely tasteless, they had the structural integrity of roofing tiles. They doubled as plates, coasters, or makeshift armor in a pinch. Many troops claimed their dental issues weren't from combat, but from trying to bite these biscuits. Then came bully beef, aka tinned corned beef. It had the visual appeal of canned cat food and the consistency of congealed regret. It was salty, oily, and could be eaten hot, cold, or with the appropriate level of emotional numbness. You sliced it, fried it, diced it, or just stared at it until your appetite left the tent. Also included in the standard ration: powdered eggs, which somehow tasted nothing like eggs, tinned jam, which could glue your jaw shut, and a smattering of oatmeal, chocolate, and dried fruits, all of which arrived in tins that took a crowbar and a prayer to open. The British Army didn't pretend its food was good. It pretended it was sufficient. And in fairness, it kept soldiers alive, barely. Field kitchens could sometimes provide stews, stewed prunes, and the occasional surprise. A real egg, a slice of bread, or something not immediately depressing. But no matter the food, there was always tea. Shells could fall, trucks could explode, but if there was hot water, there was a brew. And in that mug, steaming in a muddy trench, was Britain's greatest ration of all: stubbornness in a cup. By mid-war, British soldiers weren't just fighting the Axis. They were fighting ration fatigue, an invisible enemy that came disguised as another tin of corned beef. The British military supply system was held together with string, hope, and a suspicious number of forms in triplicate. Fighting across multiple continents, from North Africa to Italy to the jungles of Burma, meant rations got weirder the farther you were from London, and colder, and often squishier. A ration in Cairo might arrive slightly warm and edible. A ration in the Burmese jungle? It might arrive mouldy, half-eaten by ants, and 2 weeks late. And still, soldiers saluted it, heated it, and ate it. Because that's what British resilience looked like, chewing quietly through despair. Water was always boiled, not just to kill bacteria, but because boiling meant tea. Tea was sacred. Men would risk sniper fire to retrieve a kettle. A warm cup could make the difference between a breakdown and a moment of British dignity in the mud. When supplies were tight, and they often were, soldiers got creative. They rehydrated powdered milk into tea whitener, spread jam on hardtack with bayonets, and seasoned meat with sarcasm. One soldier reportedly made a stew out of bully beef, raisins, and crushed vitamin tablets. The result? Morally questionable, but technically food. Tinned food was both a blessing and a curse. It lasted forever, yes, but it also required strength, tools, and sometimes divine intervention to open. Soldiers developed strong opinions about tin designs and spent entire afternoons discussing the good key roll ones versus those devil tins with no handles. When something fresh did show up, an egg, a loaf of bread, an actual vegetable, it was cause for celebration or suspicion. One soldier, upon receiving a fresh tomato, stared at it for an hour before deciding to keep it as a pet. Despite the rationing, the blandness, and the biscuit-induced jaw pain, British troops remained stoic. They grumbled with dignity, made jokes about their own digestion, and above all, kept calm and carried on, preferably with tea. If the American soldier had rations, the German had organisation, and the Brit had tea, the Japanese soldier had rice and a terrifying capacity for suffering. The Imperial Japanese Army was built on endurance. Soldiers were taught that self-denial was noble and that hunger was part of their duty, which was convenient because most of them were perpetually starving. The standard Japanese field ration wasn't so much a meal as it was a polite suggestion. A typical pack contained white rice, barley, dried fish, pickled plums, umeboshi, soy sauce concentrate, and maybe a few hard candies. It was compact, culturally familiar, and, in the field, utterly insufficient. At first, troops set out with multi-day rations wrapped in wax paper or stored in bento-style metal tins. It looked neat, organised, thought out. And then they got to the jungle. In places like New Guinea, Burma, and Guadalcanal, the humidity turned rice into mouldy goo, rats ate through supplies, and fish went bad faster than your hopes of victory. To make matters worse, Japan's military logistics were, generously speaking, a disaster. Supply lines were stretched, bombed, blocked, or forgot to exist altogether. Many units went days, even weeks, with barely a handful of rice to split between them. Soldiers foraged, raided villages, or ate jungle plants whose nutritional value ranged from slightly helpful to hallucinate then collapse. In more desperate cases, they hunted lizards, insects, or even rats. One soldier claimed they made a soup out of boiled grass and boot leather to keep the stomach from shouting. To their credit, or perhaps horror, Japanese troops rarely complained. They believed hardship was honourable. Starving, glorious, Barefoot, inspirational, rice infested with weevils, added protein. There was, occasionally, miso paste or powdered green tea. These were prized and hoarded like wartime treasure. A teaspoon of tea could lift spirits. A pinch of salt could bring someone to tears. But overall, calories were low, suffering was high, and morale often came from sheer cultural discipline rather than what passed for a meal. The Japanese soldier wasn't just underfed, he was trained to be okay with it, and somehow, many of them kept fighting. Not because of what was in their bellies, but because of what was in their minds. The jungles of the Pacific looked lush and green in the distance, like a tropical paradise, assuming you ignored the disease, the leeches, and the smell of slow death. But for soldiers on both sides, especially the Japanese, the jungle wasn't a source of food. It was a leafy green death trap with humidity and attitude. Supply lines in the Pacific were notoriously unstable. Tropical storms, naval blockades, enemy ambushes, all conspired to make every delivery of rice, beans, or saltfish an act of divine luck. And when the food didn't come, the jungle was not your friend. Many Japanese units found themselves cut off from resupply for weeks. Soldiers had to rely on the land, which would have been fine if the land had any idea what they were doing. Unfortunately, the jungle was filled with plants that looked edible but weren't, animals that were edible but too fast, and insects that were not only inedible, but actively aggressive. Rations spoiled in hours, canned goods rusted shut, rice grew mold faster than you could light a fire. One soldier in Guadalcanal wrote, "Everything here is wet. Even my appetite is damp." What did they eat?